everyone, I hope you're well. Lisa here to do your Bitcoin forecast for the upcoming December solar eclipse in Sagittarius. So essentially this forecast, I'm looking at the next 6 months or so. So I'm looking at the period between the beginning of December 2021 and April 2022. And that's because for me, solar eclipses are like turbocharged new moons and they start 6-month cycles. So we're basically running this cycle from the solar eclipse, from one solar eclipse to another. So the following solar eclipse will be on the 30th of April 2022. So that's kind of the time period that I'm looking at, or the time horizon for this particular forecast. So it's essentially quite a long forecast, and really what I want to do is I want to continue from the lunar eclipse forecast that I did, and look at the various scenarios for a potential top for Bitcoin. So last time I looked at two particular scenarios. Will we have a top end of December, or will we have a top in sort of first quarter of January of 2022? And that's what I'm going to look at in more detail to try and kind of fine tune. Now, as I speak, Bitcoin is currently trading at around about $48,000. So it has taken a bit of a dip, which is a little bit unusual for Bitcoin, for a new moon. But we are in unusual times, and we'll get into why when we look at the astrology. So let's dive in and see what the next few months could have in store. So first up, I do want to start with some good news, and the good news is that this particular solar eclipse is actually very positive. So it happens in the 5 New South Saros series, which is something invented by an astrologer called Brady in her book Predictive Astrology, and it's kind of become a classic within the astrological fold. And basically these are based on the Saros cycles of each eclipse, which run for approximately 18.5 to 19 years. And so essentially this solar eclipse happens in the same Saros series that took place back in November 2003 or so. And she sees this as being a very positive set of eclipses that's all about kind of good news, peak experiences, and generally kind of good and happy events. So, that this seems to suggest that, between now and April that we will have a top, and, that the Bitcoin bull run has not finished. Now, I do want to point out that when we look at the Gann cycles and at some of the ingresses of things like Jupiter into Pisces, which I looked at in the lunar eclipse forecast, we see something kind of interesting. We see that often when Jupiter ingresses into Pisces, which is going to do at the end of 2021 in December, that very often prices tumble on the stock market. So I thought it was interesting, and I went back and I had a look at the other system of Saros cycle division, which is called the Ven Den Berg series. So this predates Brady's system. And it's very interesting because if we look at the Ven Den Berg series, this particular eclipse forms part of a series of eclipses that happened in October 1931 and 1945, November 1967, 1985, and 2003. So a lot of these, certainly the first 4 or so, coincide with fairly major crashes in the stock market. So there may be a need to kind of go back and look at the Saros cycles in the Ven Den Berg series, because it may help to explain what Brady's Saros system is not kind of potentially picking up. So there does seem to be some kind of discrepancy here, and I think it's reflected in the 2 different scenarios that many technical analysts are kind of forecasting as far as the Bitcoin top is concerned. So we're going to look at those 2 scenarios, as I say, in more detail, and I'm going to try and firm up what I think is most likely to happen based on the astrology and also some of the human design. So let's get into that. Okay, so this is the Bitcoin chart, and then around the outside we've got the Sagittarius Solar Eclipse kind of transposed onto the chart. So this is what we call a bi-wheel in astrology. So let's look at some of the key pointers that can perhaps indicate themes that are likely to arise between now and April. And I think do bear in mind that we are talking about a new moon, and for me, as I said, like a solar eclipse is like a turbocharged new moon. So it can sometimes wax for 3 months, and so we're only likely to see things starting to materialize fully by the time we get to the 3-month mark. So we're talking here about sort of like February, March time. so first of all, we've got the Sun and the Moon along with Mercury sitting in Sagittarius, and they're in the 5th house of speculation, which on the face of it looks bullish, definitely looks bullish, much like, you know, Brady's Saros cycle looks bullish. And then on top of that, we've got a couple of other chart points to note. So we've got the part of fortune along with Antares, which is a star in the constellation of Scorpio. And again, the part of fortune applying to the Sun and the Moon also looks really, really bullish. So the part of fortune is essentially a hypothetical point, much like the nodes, that is calculated through the ratio of the ascendant's degree to the Sun and the Moon. And this kind of gives us it's something called an Arabic part, which is, or I suppose in modern astrology, is a kind of a midpoint. And this is considered to be where we benefit most materially, or where we have the most financial abundance or luck in the material world. So again, it looks super bullish. But then I think what we do have to consider sort of here is that the South Node is also kind of present. So this particular eclipse is happening at the tail end of the dragon, not the head of the dragon. So it's slightly unusual in that respect, much like the lunar eclipse was somewhat inverted. And so I think we just have to kind of bear that in mind, that there may be initially a sell-off followed by you know, another push upwards. So that's certainly a possibility, given, you know, the positions of the luminaries and the points around them that specifically relate to the eclipse. And, you know, if we look at some of the points to sort of note, we can see that it is a little bit of a mixed bag. We do have you know, the South Node making a square to Jupiter, and a kind of an approaching conjunction to Mars. You can see Mars here in the sign of Scorpio, and it's approaching a conjunction to the South Node, but it's going to change signs before it does that. And certainly in Horary astrology, that would indicate you know, sort of an obstruction of some kind, or I think what they call refrenation, where something just about gets to a point, but then it's prevented because of the sign cusp. So I kind of feel as though it's the same sort of story, that it's almost like, certainly at the moment, everyone was like, okay, we're moving into December, there's the Halloween effect, you know, December's traditionally bullish, it's the festive season, we're talking about a very positive solar eclipse in Sagittarius, which seems upbeat on the face of it, and what's happening, like, we're actually having a sell-off, so the inverse is sort of happening. And as I say, I think that we do have to consider the involvement here of institutions and how that is changing the normal kind of state of affairs, or the normal rituals and routines and cycles associated with Bitcoin and the 4-year cycle. So, you know, we've got Saturn sitting here on the descendant of the chart, and, you know, as I've always said, I see that as being very strongly associated with institutions, and with their mindset is completely different to that of retail. So we do have to kind of bear that in mind, and we will get into that in more detail when we look at the two different scenarios, you know, kind of going forward in terms of like predicting a top. But I think that, you know, it's fair to say that with Saturn in this position, it is depressing price. It is depressing sentiment, you know, because it's sitting on the descendant, which is traditionally to do with the attitudes that buyers and so on, the stakeholders, Bitcoin stakeholders, have towards Bitcoin. So it is depressing sentiment. It might, and also the other thing is that it is applying by square to Uranus. Now this is something that I mentioned last time when we did the lunar eclipse forecast, when I looked at the next 3 months. And, you know, as I mentioned then, this is the third of 3 passes of this particular square, which have essentially dominated 2021. So we had the first set of squares in mid-February, which coincided with quite a big correction on the Nasdaq. We had another set of squares in around about mid-May, and that coincided with the sell-off in Bitcoin, you know, that huge crash that we had around about mid-May. And at the same time, Jupiter also ingressed into Pisces, so there was kind of a double whammy, and I think that's why we had such a massive kind of drawdown. It was such a shock to everybody. And now we've got the third pass, which is due to perfect on around about the 24th of December, but it's already in orb as we hit this eclipse. You can see it's within 2 to 2.5 degrees of orb, which certainly in astrology is considered to be applying. And I think this is what we are seeing in the market at the moment. We've seen the Fed starting their taper early in America, which has caused panic on the stock markets. We've also had the announcement of like a new variant of COVID, which has scared investors and made them less made them more risk averse essentially, and essentially I think it's doing the same thing that it did back in February. It's sending shockwaves through the market. There's a lot of fear around, and so we're seeing stocks tumble, and Bitcoin tends to follow what's happening in the equity market. So I think that is definitely something that could depress and delay an all-time high in December. And the other thing that we also need to bear in mind is that Venus is going retrograde from the 19th of December until kind of the end of January, and that could also delay when we see a top. So that happens just before the solstice, which is considered a major turning point, and it also happens at the full moon in Gemini, which is obviously the corresponding full moon to this solar eclipse, which happens in Sagittarius. And these are polar signs. You can see Gemini on one side and Sagittarius on the other. So I do think that we do need to take those factors into consideration in terms of trying to kind of time market and sentiment. I think that December potentially is going to be a little bit problematic when it comes to to a top. But there are certain factors that we do need to keep in mind that are positive, and we'll look at those in due course. But let's continue with this particular chart. So the other thing to sort of note about this particular eclipse is that we have a very interesting set of transits happening between Venus, Pluto and Mars. So Venus is applying to Pluto in Capricorn here in the 6th house of the Bitcoin chart. And you can see that this is happening at between 22 and 25 degrees of Capricorn. And we've got Jupiter, the Bitcoin Jupiter, sitting at 29 degrees of Capricorn. So approaching the Bitcoin Jupiter. And on the face of it, again, this looks bullish because Jupiter is the ruler of Sagittarius, and Sagittarius is intercepted in the 5th house of speculation. And of course, Sagittarius and Jupiter are both associated with expansion and with growth and with with bullish sentiment. But Pluto, as I've said before, is kind of considered to be the great destroyer. It does tend to kill whatever it touches, with the view of kind of creating rebirth. It is also about rethinking, revising, but also it's also associated with a phoenix. So I do think that what we're going to see are kind of crashes or corrections followed by kind of rallies. So it's going to be a slightly different scenario to perhaps to previous years where there may have been a sort of a straight trajectory to the top. This might be a bit more volatile, and I think that also may have to do with this Saturn-Uranus square that's happening here. I think this is what is increasing volatility. Certainly as far Uranus does tend to make things more erratic. It is the ruler of the descendant, so it's making investors nervous and jumpy, and they are doing things that are slightly unpredictable. They're sort of being a little bit erratic in terms of their behavior. So I think that's why we are seeing increased volatility, because as I've said before, I do think that otherwise Saturn will be stabilizing volatility. But I think the key thing here is Uranus, which is causing a few issues. It's in the 10th house of the Bitcoin chart, and I think it's causing some jitters in the market. Now, going back to Venus and Pluto, as I said, they are applying to the Bitcoin Jupiter in the 6th house, and I think this has raised some questions around the whole kind of Bitcoin versus Ethereum kind of argument, which again we'll get into when we look at Raoul Pal in particular, who's very bullish on Ethereum, and who thinks that it's going to actually outperform Bitcoin in this this particular bull cycle. So it's possible that a lot of people are kind of reassessing and sort of rethinking whether they sort of want to be kind of Bitcoin maximalists, or whether they want to sort of diversify and also consider Ethereum, because Ethereum is obviously very big in the NFT market. Most NFT sales are made in Ethereum, and of course we just had the Ethereum 2.0 a few weeks ago, a few months ago. So you know, that's kind of raising some question marks, and I think is creating a little bit of I don't want to say kind of division within the Bitcoin community, but it certainly means that maybe a lot of the investments that would have gone solely into Bitcoin may now, some of it might be flowing to Ethereum. So that's just worth bearing in mind. But sort of, this is a positive aspect actually, because if we look at transiting Venus and Pluto, they are also applying to a square, I mean sextile to Mars and Scorpio. So this Mars is sitting in the 5th house. And of course Mars rules the midheaven of the Bitcoin chart. So it is really about where Bitcoin is headed. And it is fast, it is focused, it's all about progress, it wants to move forward at speed. So I don't think that, you know, that all is lost here. I just think that possibly you know, there are other factors that need to be taken into consideration, you know, as well, when it comes to Bitcoin and to kind of future direction of travel and exactly, you know, how, you know, again, how people view Bitcoin. You know, I mean, one argument is sort of being made that although Bitcoin has more it has more members on the network, so more nodes, and more people hold Bitcoin than any other cryptocurrency, that you know, Ethereum is not far behind, and that currently Ethereum might have the competitive edge in the sense that, you know, it's got more applications built sort of onto on top of it than Bitcoin currently does. Although that might change as a result of Taproot, which is something I discussed in the lunar eclipse forecast. That may well change as a result of Taproot, which is allowing for kind of layer 2 and layer 3 applications. And you know, if we consider that Venus is the ruler of the 4th house in the Bitcoin chart, as well as being the 11th house ruler, I do think we need to consider that the Venus's application to Pluto may well show that Taproot is going to kind of change people's opinions about Bitcoin, and maybe particularly if they have this very limited view of Bitcoin in terms of, you know, what it can do going forward, and that as it applies to Pluto, which it's going to do several times because it's retrograde. This is what's so interesting. So I think it's going to cause a rethink, this Venus retrograde, where, you know, Venus is going to apply to Pluto, then it's going to kind of back off and retrograde, and then it's going to apply to Pluto again another 2 times. So I think every time it hits that Pluto, it's also getting closer to the Bitcoin Jupiter, and it is making people rethink and possibly get more bullish about Bitcoin sort of long term. So I don't think that argument is entirely settled, and you know, all bets are off basically as far as that's concerned. And that's where I see the sextile to Mars being very, very positive. So that's definitely worth bearing in mind. And then the other thing is that Jupiter, as I mentioned last time, will ingress into Pisces on the 29th of December. And you can see Jupiter here currently at 25 degrees of Aquarius, and it is sitting on the Bitcoin Neptune, but it's applying to Venus. And as I've said before, this can indicate potential all-time highs, because this is the combining of the 2 benefics. And but I think the key thing here is that, as I say, Venus is going to retrograde, which might affect the Bitcoin natal Venus, and also, as I've said before, you know, Jupiter's ingresses into Pisces historically have been associated with losses. You know, if you think about May time, I think within a day of that crypto crash that we had so with Bitcoin, Jupiter moved into the sign of Pisces, and it did so until around about July, which is when Bitcoin's sort of mid-cycle slump basically ended. So around about the time of that B-word conference. Shortly after that, Jupiter it retrograded back into the sign of Aquarius. So those are also factors that we need to sort of bear in mind when trying to kind of time a top. So to me, this kind of adds fuel to the idea of the argument for longer cycles. And a couple of people have already made this argument. So Raoul Pal himself, a former hedge fund manager, and obviously someone who's very prominent in the Bitcoin community, thinks that as more institutions enter Bitcoin, which he thinks is likely to increase in around about January, February, it could prolong the bull market into the spring or summer of 2022. So his kind of timing is between March and June 2022 as being the top. And this, forms a confluence with the Ken Stanfield model, which again I looked at in the last forecast, and we're going to look at again, in which he says that markets, Bitcoin cycles are getting 43% longer with each cycle. So he thinks the top will be towards the end of May 2022, which he says is 7 days from halving, and along with 369 and 572, these have been important days to look at in relation to, I think, block height, and indeed have coincided in this cycle with all-time highs. So, for example, we had an all-time high around about the 20th of October, and this was only a couple of days off from the 572 mark, which was around about the 16th of October. So it may explain why we had that top, that unexpected all-time high, sort of mid-October. So let's look at some possible dates, for a top. As I've said, in terms of 2021, traditionally most people in the Bitcoin community have assumed that we're going to have a top towards the end of December. So the date that I've chosen for this is the 29th of December, which is when Jupiter reaches the Bitcoin Venus in Pisces. You can see here Jupiter at 0 degrees of Pisces making a conjunction to the Bitcoin Venus. Now, it does so from the 7th house, which is, again, investment. So this is speculative investment, bullish investment. And, at the same time, we've got Mars transiting through the 5th house, and it's making a lovely trine here to the Bitcoin ascendant. So this is all looking extremely positive. In fact, it's making a sextile to the Bitcoin descendant. So a nice little sort of mini grand trine going on there, which does look very, very bullish. However, we can see that there's also this big red cross going on in the chart, and this is what we call a grand cross, which is made up of 2 T-squares. So this involves Saturn in Aquarius on the descendant, Uranus in Taurus sitting in the 10th house, as well as the Bitcoin ascendant and the moon, which is down here in Scorpio. So this could be potentially a bit of a downer, shall we say. It does tend to cause a lot of tension. It slows things up because it is a fixed square, so it tends to be very stubborn and immutable, so it's very difficult to get things to budge. So it's almost like in a price chart, price hitting resistance, so that's sort of that threshold where we tend to have swing failure patterns. So it's possible that we might have a kind of a run-up as a result of Jupiter and Mars, but then there's a swing failure pattern and we get a kind of a fake out kind of happening. So that's certainly possible. And also, the other things that we have to consider here is that transiting Mars in Sagittarius is applying to Saturn, so it's almost kind of emphasizing, or kind of, it could potentially activate that grand cross which Saturn forms a part of. And this could, again, sort of have to do with taper tantrums, which have already started because the Fed has tapered early. So, if we think that this date, 29th of December, is only 5 days off from the exact squaring of the Saturn Uranus square, I do think that there's going to be market jitters and possibly, kind of crashes going into January. The other thing is that Pluto is applying by conjunction to the Bitcoin Mercury. We can see here there's Mercury at 2 degrees of Aquarius, and Pluto, is at 25 degrees of Capricorn. So potentially, that could lead to, that could cause a flash crash with leverage, because Mars in the 5th house of speculation does tend to be quite, it does tend to take risks. It's quite impulsive and, kind of sort of tunnel vision-y. So we do have to be very, very careful of that. But I think given that Pluto is not going to reach Aquarius until next year, until 2022. It's actually going to go retrograde, I think, towards the end of January. I don't think there's any danger of that sort of really as a result of Pluto. Again, it's similar to that sort of reformation that I was talking about, in horary astrology. However, we do have to be careful of Mars, as I say, because it is very it does rule the Bitcoin midheaven, and it is in the fifth house of speculation and of kind of gambling. So I think we're going to have to watch the futures market, because it could potentially, people could get a little bit carried away with leverage and so on. So, just worth kind of bearing in mind. And then we have Raoul Pal, who is talking about or suggesting that Ethereum could outperform Bitcoin this cycle, and he bases it on what he calls, on Metcalfe's law, because he thinks that the Ethereum network currently has more uses due to its application layer. Plus, it's stablecoin ties. Most stablecoins operate on the Ethereum network, and so it could grow to outperform Bitcoin this cycle. But I do wonder whether Taproot is going to change this. So I don't think that it's a foregone conclusion. I think we do need to sort of bear in mind, as I say, the movements of Venus in the Bitcoin chart, because this to me is pointing to that kind of Taproot upgrade that we had a few months ago. And so even though Ethereum might get to 20k, I still think that Bitcoin is it's not necessarily going to get to the highs that Bitcoin will kind of get to. So overall, he thinks that the cycle is also going to elongate as more institutions adopt Bitcoin, and because of Ethereum staking, he thinks that Ethereum staking and NFTs will lock up supply, particularly during the early part of 2022, and so he thinks that the bull run could extend to spring-summer 2022, which is what Ken Stanfield is saying too. So for him, this particular cycle is mimicking the Bitcoin 2013 cycle, but as we've seen, cycles are lengthening, and so it might not necessarily mimic this sort of this point of the chart going forward between October and December, because of these extra factors that increase volatility and that increase uncertainty. So he initially said that he thought that Bitcoin was following the 2013 cycle, and that this pointed to a ridiculous year end. But as we've seen, the 29th of December, certainly the period between the 24th and 29th of December, is not looking good astrologically because of the Saturn-Uranus square and the ingress of Jupiter into Pisces. So he's kind of qualified this now, and he said that as more institutions are now in the game, they behave differently to retail based on the difference in psychology that we've already talked about. So he says that they have quarterly buybacks and sell-offs, much like with equities, to balance the books. And so this could change the cycle. So he thinks that we could be following what he calls the cycle of kind of max pain, the route of max pain for retail investors, where you think you've kind of reached a high, then there's a massive crash, but then things rally again kind of after that, and so people might sort of sell too early. Now, this also points to what Raoul Pal was saying about the difference between retail and institutional psychology. So this is what makes the 2021 cycle different. Both of them are kind of emphasizing, both Stanfield and Pal are emphasizing the difference between retail versus institutional market psychology. So traditionally, if we look at this in terms of astrology, retail is very emotional and has short time horizons. So they tend to take more risk, and that they also take on more leverage. And so in astrological terms, this dovetails very well with the idea of the moon as well as Jupiter. Both of these are quite bullish. They tend to be quite emotional. The moon certainly is the fastest of the planets in the astrological pantheon, and so it has more kind of waxing and waning, which fits with this idea of retail kind of flipping from sort of being bullish one day to bearish the next within a very short space of time, and retail often being affected by things like the news, FUD, etc. So this can cause them to make a lot of mistakes, and it's why like 90% of retail investors lose money. And we can see this too in the Bitcoin chart. If we consider that Bitcoin is also very responsive to lunar phases, this is not entirely surprising given that Bitcoin has an Aries moon, which is very reactive. It's Mars ruled, and it also tends to be quite prone to risk taking. And it's traditionally in the Bitcoin chart, it's in the ninth house, which is faith-based. So again, we can see why the moon in the Bitcoin chart fits quite nicely with the idea of retail and retail psychology. Now, there's a sort of, when we're talking about institutional psychology, like Saturn, which is traditionally the moon's counterpart, institutions have longer time horizons. They have different goals, and they use more technical analysis to make decisions. So generally speaking, they tend to be less emotional. They have longer time horizons. Raoul Pal was talking about how they tend to sort of do things in quarterly terms, and they tend to be more kind of technical based in terms of how they make decisions as opposed to retail. So they're more risk averse, and they also can manipulate markets because they are much bigger players. So if they decide to sell, obviously it creates a lot of sell pressure in the market, and that can push price down quite substantially, or create sell walls or buy walls, that kind of thing. So I think this is why, for me, Saturn and Pluto, to an extent, both represent this kind of institutional influence on Bitcoin, and why we are seeing sort of reduced volatility, given Saturn, coming up to, as I say, the descendant in the Bitcoin chart, but also Pluto, which is not far behind Saturn actually, and rules the fifth house of speculation. So Pluto in the sign of Capricorn, which is traditionally the sign of the establishment. So I think we do have to kind of bear that in mind, that these players, when they make big moves, they can affect the market quite dramatically, so that's kind of Pluto. And they can also be a little bit sneaky or underhanded, kind of placing big shorts, and also, as I say, being quite risk averse. So having different buying and selling patterns to say retail. So I think we have to bear in mind here with that Saturn, as I say, is currently on the Bitcoin descendant, and it is it's going to approach that square to Uranus, which is going to increase volatility short term because of Uranus, which is sort of very skittish, shall we say. It's very highly strung, so creating sort of fear and uncertainty, and that is going to make a conjunction on the 24th of December. So even though that period is traditionally quite bullish, I think it could send some jitters through the market. So we need to be very careful, I think, trading through December, particularly the end of December, A, because of Jupiter ingressing into Pisces, and B, because of the Saturn-Uranus square that could throw a spanner in the works. So in terms of Ken Stanfield's model, he is suggesting, as I say, that Bitcoin cycles are getting longer by about 40%. And he also thinks, therefore, that the peak of the current cycle will only come next year in spring 2022. So his date for a top is around about the 25th of May 2022. But he does say that it will start in mid-October and will have 3 waves. And these are based on those all-important days associated with block height and days from halving. So the 3, 6, 9, 5, 7, 2, and 7, 4, 7 days from halving, which he's kind of plotted, and he said tend to be when we get all-time highs in the market. So we can see here that I think this is his 369 day was the 13th of May, which was exactly when Bitcoin reached a high and then crashed. The second was the 572 days from halving, which is the 16th or the 15th of October, and of course we had that peak in the market on around about the 16th of October or 20th of October, and then the 747 day from halving, which is around about the 25th of May 2022. So I think a key date to watch for in terms of an all-time high. Now, the other thing that I think is very interesting when we're looking at the forecast for the solar eclipse is the human design alignments and activations. Now, these basically take the astrology and they put them into the I Ching hexagrams, and they give us another sort of dimension to look at in terms of predictions. So it's interesting that this particular solar eclipse is going to happen in hexagram 5, which is known as waiting for the rain or attending the sacrifice. And this is all about universal timing, earthly rituals, and repeated regimens that help to kind of regulate sacral or life force energy, which is orange, incidentally. This is the orange chakra in the sort of the body system, and that fits for me very nicely with the kind of nature of Bitcoin, which is all about kind of generation and wealth and abundance and all that kind of stuff, that feminine energy of the womb. So I think it's super interesting that it's talking about the need to observe timing and to wait for the right time to act. And in fact, I thought it's so interesting. It reminded me so much of that quote from Ecclesiastes 3, which is, there's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. So this particular hexagram is very much embedded in a metaphor of planting crops and gardening, so feeding and nurturing young plants or animals so that they have an opportunity to grow and flourish. And of course that particular process can't be rushed. I think this idea of lengthening cycles, there may be sort of something in it, and we're going to look at that, in a minute. But again, in the human design system, we are talking about gate 5, which is hexagram 5, in the sacral center, and this forms part of the channel of rhythm, which connects the sacral to the G center. And this is all about syncing our individual biorhythms and daily routines to universal cycles. So again, this idea of there being a season for everything. And, I think, in terms of the planets, I think that they can help us to kind of time things so that we kind of correlate, or we look for confluence between the Bitcoin patterns and cycles and cosmic cycles such as, the planets. Now, to get even more detail, we're talking about line 2, which is about right timing, and this is all about finding tranquility, so watchfully waiting for the right time to act. It's all about patience, allowing things to unfold naturally, and doing things kind of at a natural pace, feeling comfortable with divine timing. And I think this is really pointing to the need to wait, for us to be patient, to really also just consider the like looking at price in the Bitcoin chart, rather than kind of going, okay, well, the 4-year cycle says that we should have a top in this based on the fact that, in previous cycles, X, Y, and Z. I think the key thing is to really kind of come into the moment, to accept that this cycle may be different in many ways, that the cycle is lengthening, something that we looked at in the previous video, the lunar eclipse video. And therefore, with Saturn coming up to the descendant, slowing things down a little bit, it may be a time to be patient, and to really kind of become very present and neutral, and watch and wait to see what signs and signals we get from the charts as to what exactly is going on. So let's look at some possible dates based on the astrology for 2022 for a top. So January, I think unlikely, and that's because of two things. The first thing is that Venus will still be retrograde, so you can see that it's moved by the time we get to it's moving backwards, so it's not kind of approaching the Bitcoin Jupiter. It's moving away from the Bitcoin Jupiter. It's going backwards. And on top of that, Mercury's going to retrograde from mid-January to the early part of February, and this is traditionally not a great time for any market. It tends to, cause confusion. It tends to make exchanges kind of go down. We see that all the time with Coinbase. We saw it in May, June when we had the eclipses back then. Mercury was retrograde, certainly for the lunar eclipse, and it caused absolute mayhem, as far as confusion and so on was concerned. So I think it's unlikely that we'll have a top in January. Now, what about February? Well, my sort of best case scenario for February is the 16th to the 18th of February, and that's because Venus and Mars are going to form quite a rare conjunction to each other around about that time, and it's going to happen also as we reach the full moon in Leo. Now, it's super interesting because here is the full moon in Leo, which is in the Bitcoin. It's in the first house of the Bitcoin chart, and what you can't see here is that actually this is very close to the Bitcoin part of increase, which is traditionally considered to be super bullish. It's sort of a Jupiter Arabic part, so it tends to be about where things go up, essentially, where price goes up. So this could be a date for a new all-time high, or certainly for some kind of rally. And on top of that, the sun, the sun is approaching a conjunction to the Bitcoin Venus. So you can see the sun in Aquarius is approaching a conjunction to the Bitcoin Venus. But again, it has to change signs in order to get there. So you know, it only ingresses into Pisces on the 18th of February, so several days later, and that may be what kind of clamps or sort of clinches it, if you like. It could be, you know, when we kind of hit an all-time high. So for February, that's my best guess scenario. And now what about March? Well, March, we also have a repeat of the Venus-Mars conjunction, but this time in the sign of Aquarius. So the first time this happens, it happens in the sign of Capricorn, which is obviously in the 6th house. Second time it happens is in Aquarius. It happens at 0 degrees Aquarius, so very close to the Bitcoin Mercury. And of course, Mercury does rule the 2nd house of price, as I've mentioned before in the Bitcoin chart. So that also looking very, very bullish. So Venus and Mars here, essentially combining the MCIC axis, you know, in terms of rulership, which again is very bullish. So this is when I think the whole kind of taproot thing could really catch hold. People could sort of rethink any preconceived assumptions that they might have around, you know, Ethereum being better than Bitcoin because of applications. As I say, I think Bitcoin's going to catch up because of this taproot upgrade. So I don't think it's a done deal, essentially. And this is when we could see people change their mind, and you know, as a result, we have people piling into Bitcoin. Plus, the Pisces Sun and Jupiter will be approaching a conjunction to the Bitcoin Venus in the 8th house. So we could possibly have like some kind of ETF here as a catalyst. And I know some people are speculating that we might have an Ethereum ETF launched at around about that time. But equally, we could have another Bitcoin ETF. And given that Jupiter's in the 8th house, which for me is associated with, you know, ETFs and kind of derivative funds, it's entirely possible that this is you know, this is the case. But Jupiter, you know, and Jupiter on top of it, you know, is as I say, associated with bullishness and with speculation. So again, you know, if we're talking about March, this looks very, very bullish to me. So that is my kind of outlook for the period between December 2021 and the first kind of quarter of 2022. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you enjoy my forecasts, do go and check out my blog, the Astro Insights blog, because I always post my forecasts on the blog as well as on YouTube. And also you can follow me on Twitter. AstroPhoebe is my handle, so check me out there, because I do often post stuff about Bitcoin there. But yes, I hope that it's going to prove useful and help you kind of navigate what could potentially be a slightly unusual December for Bitcoin. So wishing you all the very best. Merry Christmas, have a wonderful festive season, Happy New Year, and I'll catch you again for my next forecast in April. So for those of you who are wondering how this eclipse stands to affect you personally, you can always purchase one of my individual eclipse horoscopes for each of the 12 zodiac signs via the Astrology Sphere shop. So that's at shop.astrologysphere.com, or you can go to my website astrologysphere.com and just click on the link in the menu for the Astrology Sphere shop. Alternatively, you can always upgrade to gold membership on my website and get access to all 12 signs for just $4.99. These are 6 months forecasts that include solar eclipse themes for the next 12 months, as well as an additional extended forecast that looks at the important planetary transits between December 2021 and April 2022, so using the cosmic calendar. For details, you can go to my website, astrologysphere.com/subscribe, or you can visit the Astrology Sphere shop.